Hello, welcome back to Shatter Our Souls with Novaria. As per usual, we're just going to quickly touch off the rules. I cannot use any major weapons that fit within the three weapons tabs. That includes swords, shields, and bows. Anything that does not fit within those three tabs are fair game for this challenge to beat the game with the minimum weapons possible. Now, as I was going on with looking into what Breath of the Wild has to offer, I realized that Breath of the Wild is somehow both bigger and smaller than the Zeldas that came before. And I want to look into that. Now, who all remembers what I'll call the old days of gaming? Back in the 90s, early 2000s. Yes, I'm aging myself here. But if you look back at A Link to the Past, Ocarina of Time, Shadow of the Colossus, and numerous various Final Fantasies that all had this open world or semi-open world concept, the idea was that the player's imagination would take control and allow them to experience the world without having every single detail told to them. Now, the reason why I love this kind of mentality around games actually comes from the fact that, one, I grew up in it, but two, this era of gaming that was known for being more about player freedom, but also about just what would you find around the next corner. There wasn't always a be-all end-all statement that came from developers or even a big yellow arrow pointing you in the direction of where you needed to go. And this is, I think, pretty important to mention because in a lot of what I'll call the modern era of gaming, we have become more complacent when it comes to what I'll call the list, if you will. And a lot of games are guilty of this. Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed is guilty of the list. And if you don't know what the list is, it is a gigantic checklist on your map that says, hey, these are all the tasks that we want you to be able to complete. These are things from treasure chests over there to a monster horde over there, a couple side missions scattered about. Oh, we also got a tavern, a couple of merchants, But you have to go there and discover it before we can tell you exactly what it is. The list had modernized what gaming was. It ensured that players that were more completion-oriented as far as their goals when playing a game could be met. And that's a somewhat good thing. But it also took a lot of the mystery, a lot of the whimsy of gaming away. Because if you look back at Shadow of the Colossus, and I'm going to use that one as my de facto item for this particular challenge or statement here. You had what was effectively an open world. You had 16 boss fights to get to. And not a whole lot else. And while the world wasn't necessarily lived in, a lot of players spent time questioning why the Forbidden Lands were what they were. Why were they in the state they were? And trying to piece together a puzzle. Don't get me wrong, not every game needs to be cryptic, but we also shouldn't have... I also believe that this idea that there should be an explanation for everything is the way to go either. We've gone full circle, where less is more now. We've found the precipice. Because if you look at games like Witcher 3, games which have absurdly well thought out worlds and absolutely beautifully planned out individual writings and scriptures and lore thrown throughout the game, you can't go wrong. But every time I have to sit down, stop what I'm doing, and read a book on the lore of this area to get a better understanding of what's going on around me, it ironically takes me out of the world. Because I'm no longer just experiencing it. I'm going and digging for information. And some games take this digging for information side of further than, let's say, Witcher 3. Look at Dark Souls and its item descriptions. The item descriptions are there specifically to provide you lore, provide information on the different characters that within Lordran. And yet, at no point in time do you really get pulled out of it, because trying to discover the lore is part of the puzzle. I suppose what I'm getting at is that we've become inundated with checklists. A must complete A, B, C, D in order to continue. Whereas older games, while they did have a checklist to be certain, were a lot more freeform about how it happened, what we looked for, and how we wanted to go about it. Breath of the Wild tries to take the idea that was presented in earlier games and try to revolutionize it. Make Zelda more about the world than the characters. Does that make any sense? What I'm getting at when I say more about the world, less about any individual character, is that if you took your time digging through Zelda Ocarina of Time, certain characters would come out as being important. Characters like Roru and Zelda. You have the Zora Princess, Ruto, and Darunia. Each of these characters kind of sticks out as being unique in some capacity or another, and allows the player another brief look into the world as a whole. You can, in some capacity, begin to understand what each character, each race within the world is thinking and trying to solve in some capacity just by taking your time and talking. It tries to put you in that world. When you end up with Breath of the Wild, where every single character, NPC, every single concept has a name, now we're starting to look like we're in the office with a giant wall of string behind us trying to unravel the mysteries. Some might see this as a good thing. I personally see it as something that is too much. I don't want games to take over my life in a way that I have to dig for every individual aspect of it. But in the same vein, I want games to be fleshed out and fully realized. And it's a really hard tightrope to walk. Something that developers of all walks have managed, and many have fallen short of. But who knows? Maybe I'm just overthinking this whole problem. Welcome to the Shields from Water Shrine. Now, I'll admit, the area around, I believe this is the Zora's Domain area. I didn't actually pay attention to what the tower was called when I was looking into this area. Overall, I find this area to be one of the better areas in Breath of the Wild. And it comes, I suppose, with a couple caveats here, as does everything. My first and foremost statement is that this is one of the areas of the games that is more heavily scripted. Now, a lot of gamers might say that scripting is bad. I don't. A scripted game just means that the developer has more active control over what they are trying to present to the player. And this is a good thing. I have no complaints about that. But I suppose this area has a lot of what I'll call a push towards getting the player to go in a certain direction, following a specific path. It just so happens that they designed this, or the area around Zora's domain, the high road through the mountains, to be I suppose a comparison point to the open-ended approach to Zelda that they had created. They opted for two, I suppose, alternative approaches to the game as a whole. The first was that the player has to be able to have the freedom to do what they want. First and foremost rule. But a scripted location where the plan is set out for you, where you effectively have, you go here, do the thing, and we'll catch up with you in a little bit, isn't necessarily as common in Zelda Breath of the Wild's, I suppose, overall game design. And sometimes that's for the better, sometimes it's for the worse. When they do a scripted segment, like the walk from up the side of Lanayru Mountains, it really showcases a lot of how well thought out the game actually is. How the devs planned around almost every conceivable solution that could come up, and made it so that a given area had a specific solution or specific path to take. Littered with enemies across the entire battlefield. It's one of, if not the most impressive shows of what can be done with proper scripting. But Zelda Breath of the Wild is nothing if not fickle. And so what we end up with for 80% of the game is a much more relaxed type of title. And perhaps that's a good thing. A lot of titles in modern and older gaming have fallen into, I suppose, two distinct camps. There's the everything has to be as scripted and straightforward as possible. They're holding your hands through the entire ordeal, pulling you through every single story segment of the game, because what else do you do? Or you have the other end of the spectrum, where you're given complete freedom, but no direction. Breath of the Wild offers direction and freedom, but rarely at the expense of freedom. Usually with numerous scripted events like the battles against the divine beasts, or even the pathways leading to said divine beasts, being notably more challenging than some of the other locations across the game. It is kind of a strange circumstance, I suppose, to get into that. But be that as it may, we end up with all sorts of unique circumstances. Now, I had kind of talked at least partially about how more modern games tend to have that checklist. And I want to kind of circle back to that really quick here. The idea of the checklist, as I said, for completionists, is a good thing. Some of them use it as I want to see everything the game has to offer. And these allow the player to be able to kind of stop, slow down, or more methodically go through each of the tasks that the game may have on hand for them. This is good, but not perfect. There is, however, a somewhat separate problem that still ends up kind of making itself known here. And this problem is that it is the one of saturation. Now, I had briefly poked at Shadow of the Colossus, mentioning its world as being one that was very open-ended. And that is almost to a fault. See, if you look at certain older games like Shadow of the Colossus, you end up with a world that is, by and large, empty. There's really nothing that the game is doing or showing that the player wouldn't otherwise be able to access. And this is kind of a huge piece of information that we need to worry about, because the entire game had a very distinct goal set in mind. And during your entire travels, you would be following these waypoints that are being guided to you through your sword, just as a statement. It showed you where the next main objective was, not that you had to follow it. Whereas many of the newer games, and I'm going to actually use one that I've recently been getting into, Immortals Fenyx Rising. Its whole world is littered with challenges, different story beats. It is littered with side quests, different missions of various varieties. And while it is fun to hop from beat to beat to beat to beat, it also ends up with a circumstance wherein it's difficult to slow down. It is difficult, as I said, to slow down, but it is also difficult to simply explore. See, when the world is as saturated as it becomes in the more modern worlds or modern games, we end up where you have as much as you could possibly want to discover, and yet we are often left lacking things to discover at all. Everything is often fed to you or shown to you right off the bat. And sometimes this is potentially good. Look at the towers in in Breath of the Wild here, where you find vantage points and use that to just get the map. But you need to find and fill it in yourself. Find the points of interest on the map. Find that long distant mountain and say, hey, yeah, I'm going to go climb that. Immortals Fenyx Rising does something very similar to Breath of the Wild, in that it doesn't just say, oh, here's everything you need to do today, have fun. It forces the player to find things, but it teaches you right off the bat how to abuse that system, and really digs in hard about making sure that you are well acquainted with this system before moving on, where it will reveal different markers and objectives on the map. It's the exact same system as the towers in Assassin's Creed, just with extra steps now. And while that is a bit more engaging, we simultaneously still lose that feeling of discovery. And it's that feeling of discovery that I think really drove the 90s, 2000s gaming. The idea that we went from 2D to now 3D gaming. And now suddenly, oh, that wall looks weird? I wonder what's behind it. Becomes a much more difficult question to answer. And you come back to these certain situations time and time again looking for ways around it. Or, dare I say, looking at the different pieces of architecture or trying to find the last secret of Shadow of the Colossus. I can't say that I've heard of many great hunts for secrets in video games since about 2005, when games really dug into this world building and lore scenario that I believe came up with it. And I also believe that it partially led to the rise of indie gaming. If all of a sudden, one of the key things that is a driving force behind gamers doing what gamers do and exploring and traversing these fantastical worlds, if suddenly we're left to our own devices and told, yeah, everything that you like about it is being spoon-fed to you, suddenly we start to take matters into our own hands. And a lot of players, myself especially, I noticed that in the 2005 through 2015 range, a lot of games were developed with the express intent to make the stories easy to digest in the AAA side of things, but much more cryptic and a little bit more, what's the word I'm looking for? Whimsical on the indie side of things. And there's nothing wrong with this. I want to be very clear that both sides of gaming are simply a coin toss apart. You cannot necessarily have one without the other. And whimsy is something that I believe is a driving force in this industry. But I suppose I'm getting a little off track. Why am I bringing up all the newer tropes of games and whatnot when I'm trying to talk about the old days? Because, as strange as it is, Breath of the Wild tries its darndest to be a marriage between the two. Cryptic enough that there's something to discover around any corner. That something that allows the player to see the map and have distinct markers to follow in terms of landmarks, but is also trying its darndest to make sure that the player has direction without being handheld, has purpose without being a driving force. It's the player's creativity and freedom that ultimately drives them forward. But Breath of the Wild tries to take that and make sure that the player actually feels that level of freedom, feels that level of attachment to the world. And Breath of the Wild is what I would unironically consider a cozy video game. Not every game has to be this very bombastic, action-packed game. For me, Breath of the Wild is one that, after a long day's work, when I'm exhausted and don't really want to get up off the couch, it's one of the first games I'll reach for. Simply because the world itself is, well, not peaceful, let's be clear, but it does have a bit more of a cozy or comfortable atmosphere to it. And the fact that I can mess around or find alternative means of doing what I need to do within the game to make the actions and solutions more feasible is something that I have to praise this game for. And reality is that I do a lot of praising. Oh, geez, that was almost shocking. And I think our little friend, the Moblin, Bokoblin, fell into the water there. And the Moblin shortly thereafter. I don't know what happened to the second guy. Couldn't tell you to be... Anyways. At this point, I'm going to be starting to... Well, I have a couple plans for the next couple of videos here. And the first is that I want to finish clearing out what I can of Zora's Domain. there are going to be a couple shrines in this area that are simply not possible. Specifically, there is one just to the east of Zora's Domain called Daga Keek Shrine. And to access it, you have to jump off a waterfall and land a strike on a Sheikah pillar thing. Not a huge issue. Until we get to the fact that it is a... in order to do that specific attack, I kind of need a weapon to begin with. And so I can guarantee that this particular action is simply not viable at this point in time or in this specific challenge. But to my understanding, that is the only shrine in the entire Lanayru area that is unattainable. So we're going to clean out about half a Lanayru, get to Zora's Domain, and perhaps find a way into Akala. Now, the reason I'm choosing not to do the Divine Beast is actually because I've done a fair bit of experimentation in my spare time. And without arrows, the only other really good shock options that I have are great swords or electric swords, which fall into the weapons category. Or we could go the route of consumable items like those wonderful, wonderful chew jellies. Now I use a lot of chew jelly because chew jelly is ironically one of the easier items to access. The big issue with chew jelly as a whole is that it's hard to aim. And because of its nature as an item, it has two major problems. Okay, that hurts. The first of those problems, I'm gonna have to eat here. Ow, ow. The first major issue that I'm gonna run into is probably the easiest to explain. And this first issue is that I can't pull anything out of my bag while I'm falling off a cliff. The second major issue is I can't pull anything out of my bag while I'm dangling from the paraglider. Under both circumstances, apparently Link's hands are full or are otherwise preoccupied. Therefore, unless I can land on top of the Divine Beast to drop the chew jelly directly on top of the red markings, there is nothing I can do that will allow me to be able to get through it. But we also end up with a secondary issue, wherein I also don't have access to arrows to get through the Divine Beast in the case where those, I suppose they're called Malice in this one. There's Malice and Gloom, and the Malice in this one is, it's almost impassable under current circumstances without being able to clear it out using arrows to snipe out their eyes. Therefore, it is pretty safe to say that Varuta is not possible. In fact, I would be so bold as to say that I can't get to any of the Divine Beasts. The only one that I think might be even remotely possible to get into is Rudania. And Rudania has its own set of challenges that have to be dealt with for that one. Anywho, we are going to get the tower here. And then I think we'll be signing off for today. Anywho, are there any I suppose, stories or memories of older games that you used to like. Ones that always captivated the imagination. Let me know down in the comments below. I'd love to hear it. I'd love to see or maybe experience some of those games myself. And while you're down there, if you wouldn't mind dropping a like and leaving a subscribe, that'd be absolutely phenomenal and greatly appreciated. Yeah. You know, I thought that it was going to be a lot faster to climb that tower. Anywho, the Great Lanayru Tower has been marked on our map. Until next time, I hope we all have a good one.